All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the launch of our PWNVotes 2018 webinar series. Thank you, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Looks like yes. So, as you know, my name is Arnita Rogers, and I am the Policy Director at Positive Women's Network. Today on our webinar, we are also going to be joined by Drew Gibson, who is the Policy Associate at AIDS United, one of our comrades in this movement. So thank you, Drew, for joining today. As we talk about, great, thank you, Drew. Understanding your ballot. So as I was saying, today we are launching a 5-part webinar series and prepping everybody for the upcoming midterm elections that will be taking place in November, as well as any elections that will be taking place in the primary season that have started already, and maybe as early, coming up as early as June for some other folks. Just a couple things to note before we actually get in. I see something in the chat box about it. So everybody, you are on mute. And if you have questions, I will promote you to panelists so that you can ask those questions. And feel free, if you have questions along the way, to go ahead and put those into the chat box, and we'll try to be attentive to the questions that come up in the chat box along the way. And then we'll also have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So back to the agenda, our webinar series that we're launching. Today, the first session is going to be about understanding your ballot and what's on it, what is the ballot, and really preparing yourself as someone to vote in these upcoming elections. And then we're going to be talking about shifting to engaging others in the voting process. So on June 19th, we're going to be having a webinar on building your voter universe and ways to engage others in the process. And then a little bit later in the summer, on July 10th, we're going to be talking about how to engage candidates on issues that matter to our community. So having a discussion on different tools to do that, whether it be bird dogging, which I know some folks, some callers still bird doggers, or developing candidate questionnaires and utilizing public spaces where candidates will be at to get your issues elevated to their platforms. And then a little bit later in the summer, August 14th, we're going to shift into really focusing on getting out the vote and making contact with voters. And then September 18th, as we are inching into the fall, we'll also be focusing on getting out the vote and actually turning out voters and making sure they have a plan to get to the polls. So the objectives of this webinar series is that we really want to prioritize organizing the HIV vote. We want to ensure that issues that matter to people living with HIV are at the forefront of local, state, and national elections during this election cycle and beyond. And we also want to provide tools and resources to help everyone become an informed voter and elevate issues, and to be able to talk to other voters and talk to your candidates and turn out other voters come November. So why focus on elections? Because we got the people power. People living with HIV are a huge voting bloc, and we can't let that opportunity go unmissed for the power that we could bring to the polls this year, people living with HIV and allies. So there are over 1 million people living with HIV and others receiving HIV-related services, and we need to make sure that everyone is prepped to get to the polls. And of course, we wake up and we hear the news every day. It matters who's in office, from our healthcare to access to food, to our housing, to our criminal justice system, and our policing practices. We all know that our elected officials have a really heavy hand to play in that, and voting is a way to influence who is in charge of that decision making. And contrary to a lot of popular belief or misconceptions that yes, nonprofit organizations can actually be involved in election work. and nonpartisan election work. So nonpartisan election work means that you're just not working for one party or one political candidate, that you are engaging in work that can be open to any party or any political candidate. All right, so a bit about nonpartisan election work. Some of the main goals. So voter registration. Voter registration we want to do because we want to, of course, increase the number of people who can actually vote. We know that a lot of folks experience a lot of barriers to being able to vote. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but our job is to increase the possibilities of who we can actually turn out for elections. And it's also our role to educate voters. So we don't want just people going to the polls without knowing what they're voting for. So we want to actually involve ourselves in deep voter education, help voters understand what's at stake for them, what's on the ballot, what the ballot means, and where certain candidates stand on issues that matter. Third, we also want to engage candidates. So we want to get candidates on the record addressing issues that matter to the HIV community during an election cycle. And so that could mean, getting them on the record by responding to a candidate questionnaire or in a public forum, at a bird dogging, seeing what they respond to. We want to make sure that we know where they stand before a vote is cast on their behalf. And then finally, the last stage in electoral organizing is actually turning out people to vote. And that's getting them to the polls by any means necessary and removing all barriers to make sure the folks who are registered and that we've done the work to inform and educate on what's at stake and what's on the ballot actually can make it to the polls. So today, specifically to kick off this webinar series, we wanted to focus on having a basis of understanding what's on your ballot. So a lot of folks are probably getting provisional, like ballots for their upcoming primary elections, and it's the season. So we wanted to make sure that everybody was fully equipped to learn how to do research to prepare for the upcoming election cycle. We also wanted to make sure you could learn where and what resources to use to find information to prepare yourself and others to vote. And then also what tools were out there to help evaluate candidates and issues important to your community, because especially during the primary season, the field is flooded. You might get a primary ballot with 30 people running for office. And so we want to make sure that you are able to evaluate which candidates, based on the values of what's at stake for the community, will actually, be the best person to vote for. So a bit like an electoral organizing timeline. So right now, we're focusing on voter registration. That is, we can be looking at deadlines for primaries right now, and then also making sure people are prepped for the general election coming up in November, if your primaries have passed, if the deadlines have passed. And what we're going to be talking about today is really getting informed and educating ourselves, so researching issues and candidates. And, this is ongoing. The further we get into the election cycle, there's going to be more information made available. So you really want to make sure that the research on issues and candidates is ongoing, and particularly right before the general election or the primary election, before you're going to cast those votes or encourage other people to cast votes. And then also in the process, we're not only educating each other, we're educating candidates. So we're elevating our issues, getting things into candidate platforms. We're also using those opportunities to educate them on issues that they may not have been addressing before, that we want to elevate and make sure that they're paying attention to. And then finally, in the last few weeks, 2 to 4 weeks before an election, either a primary or a general election, we really want to focus on getting out to vote. And can't stress that enough about what it takes for some people to be able to actually go to the polls. We want to make that as easy as possible, because we know that there are a lot of folks and a lot of policymakers that are bent on making it more difficult to actually cast your vote. All right, so I know we're going to be focusing on understanding your ballot, but before you can understand your ballot and before you get your ballot, we need to make sure that you are prepared to vote. And so that starts with actually being registered to vote. So I'm going to take us through a series of links that I think are helpful in kind of understanding some of the rules and requirements around what it takes to register to vote. But that I'm sure that many folks know that voting rights and rules are state-based, and so to find where your rules regarding like your elections that are coming up, you're going to need to visit either your state secretary, your Secretary of State website, or there's a number of other of resources that have become available through the 2016 election and remain ongoing for folks to find information. So I'm just going to take us through a few of these websites now. Let's see. Great. So this website is from the National Conference of State Legislatures, and they raise an important requirement is that many states have different voter identification laws. So what kind of ID that you need to be prepared to verify that you're a voter in the particular district. And we see this being a barrier for a lot of folks, seeing it being used as a proxy to intimidate folks who may be immigrants or what have you. But the voter ID laws in different states are really important, so it's something to really be mindful of, and one requirement that you should look at for your particular state. Each state also has a different voter registration deadline. Let's see. So this website, literally vote.org, was updated as of January earlier this year. So it's not super current, but it's checked pretty accurate. And it has a state by state, so you can scroll to look wherever your state is just to see what the deadlines are. When do you have to be registered to vote in the next upcoming election? And so you see some of them are the same, and some of them are quite different. In Arizona, you have by in person, you have 29 days before election day. I'm not sure why 29 days, where then you just scroll one box down. And in Arkansas, it's 30 days before an election. So you see how these things may vary. In California, it's only 15 days before an election, so about 2 weeks before an election that you have to register to vote. So it's important to be mindful of that. And then also there are opportunities for early voting or absentee votes. So many states allow, once you become registered, and the state where I live in California, you can sign up to do early voting where you can get a mailed ballot, and then you can just simply mail your ballot into the Secretary of State or your local registrar, I should say. And you don't have to be out of state. That can be if you are just, you don't think you'll be able to get to the polls, or you don't want to go to the polls, you can't get off work. So you should check in your state to see if that is an option for you. And I think it's something also to encourage other folks to do. So you don't even have to worry about it. Those people are folks, if you're doing GOTV work, you can check them off your list if you know that they've already voted early by mail. Same with absentee ballots. Some absentee laws in different states are different, and they vary. They actually might require you to be out of the state or have a reason of why you aren't able to vote in the state. But those are laws worth checking into in your state. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, that folks in our community and across our communities and intersecting communities face a lot of barriers that, and intentionally so, intentionally rooted in disenfranchising our communities on the margin from voting. And so a lot of folks think that they might not be able to vote who can, so it's also worth checking out the rules in your states around those things. So we know that for people who have been involved with the criminal justice system, they often face a lot of barriers to being able to vote. But of course, it varies in levels of severity in terms of disenfranchisement. So let's take a look here. So this says voting rights for ex-offenders, and we see that, you know, that even some states, Maine and Vermont, you know, those small populations of people who are actually incarcerated still retain the right to vote. So it might be like folks that might be operating under the assumption that, you know, once you have a felony conviction, you are, you know, permanently disenfranchised. But the states that have, I feel like the most common states are laws in which people have felonies after their release and after their parole, they're then able to vote. And so you'll see here is this website provides a great overview of the different types of laws by state that will impact people who have felony convictions, something important to note. There are also accommodations for people with disabilities, and you can check with your local registrar to see what kind of accommodations can be made for people who are living with different types of disabilities. In some districts, you can even vote from your car. If you plan to, if you can't make it out of your car, if you are getting a ride from someone, you can actually make an appointment here in California, in my district, to have a poll worker come out and actually kind of do the ballot with you in your car. And of course, early voting or an absentee ballot might be a good option there too. Or if you find out that your polling place doesn't actually have the accommodations that you need for your disability, then you can also ask about finding an alternative polling place. Let's see, and I'll visit this website real quick. So this is nonpartisan.org, and they actually have some resources. I think a lot of these are left over from the election 2016 cycle, but still on point about resources for people with disabilities in different states, and national organizations that have provided, like, you know, put together some fact sheets around resources for people with disabilities and how they can actually remove some of the barriers to being able to get to vote. And so some people also might think that you have to have a permanent address to be able to vote, and that if you are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, you might be moving from place to place, that you're not actually able to vote, and that's not true. If you are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity in some way, you can actually use the address of a shelter as your place of registration, and there are other accommodations that can be made. So that's also something to keep in mind as you are doing get out the vote work. And then also some considerations. We know that many folks in our community are survivors of intimate partner violence or different forms of abuse, and they may have some reservations about having their record or their address record disclosed, because public voting records are become public records. So your address, so where you decided to register, could be potentially looked up by an abuser, a stalker, or someone who was making you feel unsafe. And so there are actually programs to accommodate people who are domestic survivors of intimate partner violence or domestic violence or abuse, who need to maintain privacy to be able to vote. And then finally, if English is not your first language and you might have some language barriers, if you live in a particular district that has a low English proficiency, where a lot of folks don't speak English as their first language, you also might be able to seek some accommodations that are actually guaranteed by law in voting in your district. So those are all things to think about in terms of, you know, registering yourself to vote, but also really important when we think about registering others, you know, because there's a lot of misconception about why some people can't vote, and I think the misinformation is often probably intentional to keep people out of the process. All right, so to recap, we'll do a quiz question. Let's see, and then folks can just answer in the chat box, true or false. So as long as I register to vote by the federal deadline, I'll be able to vote in the next election. True or false? Yeah, one false, couple false. Yes, yes. So false is coming in. Yes. All right. So no, not stumping anybody there. But as I was reiterating that you really need to know, you need to look at your own state's registration deadlines, the rules for voter IDs, anything that you need to know, you need to go to your specific state. And even if you're going to be voting for a federal office, like your senator or representative in Congress or even the president, you still need to abide by your state's rules for eligibility to vote. So y'all are right on point. Oops. All right. So what we really want to focus on this particular webinar session was doing research on issues and candidates and really getting to know your ballot, especially so once it's grounded in you, then you'll be able to spread the word and get out the vote and educate others on what's important this election cycle. So I actually put a few pictures of my ballot that I got here in Alameda County, where I live over here. But on your ballot, you'll see that there are races for different elected offices, and they'll probably range from federal to all the way down to local ballot races. And we call those down ballot races, not because they're not important, but because they are usually featured later or on the back of ballots. And sometimes people actually don't even flip over their ballots and know that they're really important races to be voted on the back of their ballots. So in thinking in terms of down ballot races, don't think last is least. Think last might be most important because actually some of those races might be more central to your day-to-day life and make more of an impact on your day-to-day life than some of the races that might be featured first on your ballot. So just to remember that. Also on your ballot, you probably see a list of ballot measures, and they might be known also as initiatives, propositions, referendums, or referrals. You might see them referenced as any number of those things. And so, so a ballot initiative is the process that, some people refer to it as like a direct democracy, but it's the process of when eligible voters are able to petition to get something on the ballot for the full electorate to vote on. And so you might see in your state, if you are, I think there's only 24 states that actually allow the initiative process to either change the Constitution or statutes in their state. But if you are living in a state that has that available, you might be in a process where you're seeing a lot of people that are collecting signatures right now. I know in California, folks are out at anything, like if there's a rally or protest, a lot of folks have been out collecting signatures to get certain ballot initiatives on the ballot and have them qualify for the ballot. There might also be propositions, and those are usually phrased. They might say, should the California Constitution be amended to give everybody $100 on the first Friday of the month? And so I think they call it a proposition because it literally is a question thinking about the ways to change the law. There also might be something called a referendum, which is pretty much the same as the initiative, except a referendum would be to repeal a law. So those that happen it's much more rare to have a referendum than an initiative. And then there's also referrals, or legislative referrals, where a member of the state legislature would actually put a ballot measure on the ballot instead of going through the process of the traditional way that they went through the state legislature. And that would be if they were having a roadblock in trying to work with other members of the state legislature and couldn't find the political momentum to do it that way, they might propose it to go directly to the voters and say, hey, you vote on it. And so ballot measures are really important, especially when you think about this as a term of to bypass the legislature if possible. We saw last December in Maine became the first state to actually expand Medicaid in their state. They had a Republican governor that refused to expand Medicaid, and so citizens actually collected signatures and got a ballot initiative on their ballot, and then that way we're able to overrule the governor's veto to expand Medicaid. So you can see that these things are critically important, also something to really pay attention to. Also usually found a little bit later on your ballot. Here's my ballot. So don't know if people are actually able to see, but on the first page of my ballot here in California, there's about 30 people running for governor right now for the primary. I have a primary coming up in June. And if you flip over to the back side, there's U.S. offices. We've got the Attorney General, or Secretary of State, Treasurer. I also have, very hard to see, but this is folks that are running for a Senate seat in the U.S. Congress. And then on the far side, which is hard to make out, but Congresswoman Barbara Lee is running unopposed. And then I did also want to show that if you're able to, this is kind of what the ballot initiatives or propositions look like locally for me. So usually there might be a combination of, there might be statewide initiatives, and probably you're likely to see this on the November election versus your primary election, though some have qualified here in my state. You'll see a combination of numbers and letters, and that's how states and counties usually distinguish between what level initiative you're voting on, and those will vary from your district. Some key races for people living with HIV to really pay attention to, of course, your U.S. Congress, if you have an opportunity to vote for your senator or representative in your district. They're critically important in determining access to health care and any federal programs that people living with HIV rely on, from healthcare, housing, and our criminal justice system. Your governors and state legislators, are also very critically important when we think about access to healthcare and, expanding Medicaid in your local or in your state budgets for healthcare. And then we think about also your district attorneys and your local judges, which, those would definitely be considered down ballot races, but those are offices that are critically important in thinking about HIV criminalization and how we reform those laws and elevating those issues to those people. So those are just a few. Yeah, I probably do need a magnifying glass. Just saw that, Barb. Are there any other races that folks think, and you can just put in the chat box, that you think people living with HIV should be really paying attention to, either in the primaries or the upcoming elections? And Drew, feel free to chime in if you think that there are other races that folks really should be paying attention to.
I can cover that later on during my segment.
Got it. Great. Cool. So I will move us along. So when you're trying to identify, so I was saying, on my ballot, there are 30 people running for governor, many of whom I have no idea who they are. So in trying to find more information about, the candidates, I'm sure you might be getting, if you're registered to vote for a certain political party in your district, you might be getting flyers in the mail, or you might be seeing television ads if you have television or cable, seeing yard signs around. But, you really, if there's this many people in the field, especially for the primaries, you really want to figure out who they are and what they stand for. And so one resource that I've been using, or I like to use, and it's kind of like a Facebook for political candidates, is Ballotpedia. So I'll go to it now. And so I will put in, this is my home away from home at the PWN office. national office in Oakland, which is not far away from my home, so it's easy to use. So you'll type in your address, and it will ask you sample ballot lookup. So since we have that primary election going on, general election going on. Oh, hold on, I think I can see. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, make sure I get this address right. Okay, I knew those dates weren't right. Okay, so my primary election is coming up on June 5th, 2018. So I really like Ballotpedia because they can, it will pull up if you have, they have measures that have already qualified for the ballot, the statewide ballot that you can find more information on. And particularly, you can also find candidate pictures. You can click on them. And so let's see, we have Dianne Feinstein, who is the incumbent, a lot of information about her, but any of these candidates, you can click on a link. I have no idea. And so you can get a little bit more information about them. It's kind of like I was saying, it's almost like a Facebook. You see actually their pictures, but you can also see their political, their party affiliation, if they've held public office before, any other thing, any legislation that they propose, anything like that. Let's see. So those are all the candidates just for Senate. You see, like I was saying, Congresswoman Barbara Lee is running unopposed. I also can see all the candidates who are running for the Secretary of State in my state, the governor's office, all the way down. So many candidates for the Attorney General seat. So tons. So I definitely recommend using this website. There's also vote411.org, which is similar. I think I don't know if they have like as many like the photos of folks or all the ballot measures included, but I also think that one is a very helpful site to use in trying to find more information about your candidates. And then there's also that you can use local resources to find out more about your candidate and their affiliations and any disclosures that they've made about their run for office. And so here I have that comes with the ballot here that I get in Alameda County. It is the voter information guide, and hopefully you get one of these in your state. And these are really helpful because they actually contain candidate statements, which I took a picture of a few candidate statements for some folks that are running for to be a member of the state assembly in California. It shares like what their party affiliation is, what they've done before, and their platform, what issues, what policy issues that they plan on taking up if they were to be elected into office. And then also in this voter information guide that comes with the ballot when you get a ballot, or it may come separately like a few weeks or a month earlier or later. It also contains information on the ballot measures that you're being asked to support. So they might often contain who's in support. There might be local organizations or business groups that are in support of a proposition, and they'll provide an argument and why. And then they often have the same thing for like a rebuttal. So somebody might offer opposition statement for a particular ballot measure, and they'll also have an opportunity to provide a rebuttal. So you can actually see it's kind of like a print debate around what the ballot measure will do. And that's really helpful to see who's involved in that debate. Rather even just the debate itself, it's often good to see who cares about this issue. Is it the local chamber of commerce? Is it the nurses association? Why do they care? Those are all things to think about. Great. And then so particularly for our folks that especially our chapters that are doing GOTV work and are going to be working on electoral organizing throughout this season, we developed a ballot measure screening tool to kind of help assess, to make some of those evaluations that I was just talking about from the information that you can find either on Ballotpedia or your local resources, to use those things then to like really hone on and evaluate, you know, the resources and energy that you commit to elevating that issue or that candidate. So this is particularly for ballot measures, but this is a series of questions that if you are a group of folks, of members or chapters, folks from your chapter or even voters that you're just, you know, reaching, you can go through this process and kind of ask these questions. So like the first question being, does the ballot measure address or align with PW's mission and principles or a policy agenda? So, you know, are any of the issues that we talk about in our policy agenda, sexual reproductive health and rights, criminalization, violence against women living with HIV, universal health care, are any of those things reflected or mentioned in this ballot measure? You can think about would the impact of the ballot measure be deeply like felt by PW's base or women living with HIV? Would it be widely felt? Would it affect many people in PW's base? It's also really good to know who is responsible for the ballot measure. Is it a local legislator? Like I was saying, legislators that have had gridlock in their own legislature, they can actually put a ballot measure on the ballot. So is it a local legislator that's done it? Is it a private interest group or corporation? Or was it another group of citizens who rallied together to collect signatures to actually get something on the ballot? And I won't go through all of these, but I think, and this will be shared with everyone, but I think these are really great questions to kind of ask as you're thinking about how you evaluate whether you would like to support or actually elevate particular issues to candidates or organize other voters around. And then so, of course, there are different advocacy organizations that have candidate ratings and reports. The League of Women Voters is one, and I think they really provide some great resources that are really accessible and can be shared pretty easily. And then, you know, just staying up to date with local news alerts and national news. You can even, if you're really interested about the progression of a particular issue that's gaining momentum, you can create a Google alert, or if you want to keep tabs on a particular candidate, see where they are, you can create a Google alert. But, you know, chances are in election season, we're all going to be getting inundated with a ton of information. So what's even more important than collecting all the information is really being able to evaluate that information and see where it's coming from. And I think Drew is going to actually talk about evaluating the sources where we get our information from in his presentation. Right. So I know that was a lot. So another quick quiz question. So the earlier a candidate appears on my ballot, the more important they are. True or false? False. False. Sure. Yeah, these are givens. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily matter the order in which some offices might appear on your ballot. You guys are right that some of the quote unquote down ballot races are actually more critically important to the day-to-day lives of all of us, and so we should also be paying attention to those races as well and draw other folks' attention to those races. Great. Cool. So I will turn it over to Drew now.
All right, thank you, Arnita. I'm just going to be talking a little bit about community resources, sort of researching issues and candidates to make sure you're informed going into the ballot box in November and for your primary votes if they haven't happened yet. Next slide. Okay, AU is coming out with an election resource toolkit. We are aiming to unveil it on June 4th. And it's basically going to have a three-pronged approach to informing and mobilizing HIV voters in 2018. The first part is going to be a voter center, which is more focused on individual action, getting yourself informed about the issues, making sure you're registered to vote, all your ducks in a row. Second is going to be election resources for community-based organizations, and that is going to involve sort of the do's and don'ts of what a 501c3 can and cannot do in terms of voter education, getting out the vote efforts, and advocacy. The final part is going to be getting engaged with the community, and a lot of that's going to be the sort of work that PWN is doing in terms of mobilizing voters and getting the community really revved up and ready to go for this November. Next slide. Okay. In the voter center, there's going to be a sort of a comprehensive checklist of what you need to do and know going into the voting booth. And a lot of that has to do with making sure you are informed and making sure that the questions that you want answered actually are answered, especially with candidates that are farther down the ballot. The likelihood that they will directly address HIV or HIV-related issues is not that high. So in a lot of instances, you're going to have to be your own best advocate and either working by yourself or more likely with other AIDS service organizations or CBOs, making sure that candidates go on the record in terms of their policies related to HIV. So that sort of outreach is something that I'm sure PWN will be working hard on in terms of candidate questionnaires and things like that. But it's very important to be your own best advocate. In terms of where you get your news, I'd recommend shameless self-plug here, checking out AIDS United's blog. As the year goes on, we try and update as much of election coverage as we can, but we don't do as much state or local-based work just due to our nature as a federal advocacy organization. But if you have any races or ballot initiatives that you think are really important to the HIV community, not only at the local level or the state level, but nationwide, feel free to reach out to me or anyone sort of on the AU policy staff to bring it to our attention, and maybe we'll have the bandwidth to cover it in some detail, or to suggest that it be covered by a different organization. Places like the Body or Pause are always doing great election-related coverage, and that should be a go-to for folks when trying to figure out who you want to vote for and how you want to address different ballot initiatives. In terms of election resources for CBOs, we'll probably go over this more at a later date on a different webinar. But the key thing to know right off the bat is that just because you work for a nonprofit or you are a 501c3 does not mean that you have to be silent during an election. There are plenty of ways in which you can do voter outreach and education. And in the toolkit, we'll have links to sort of a bunch of checklists from Alliance for Justice and some other organizations explicitly spelling out what it is you can and can't do. Without going into too much, the basic rule of thumb is you can't, there's no endorsement of candidates, but you can you can feature their statements and question them and prod them to get them to come out either in support or against an issue that you care about. So as long as you stay issue-based as opposed to candidate-based, you're probably going to be in a good place. In terms of getting engaged with the community, I think there are a lot of ways in which outside of the immediate HIV community, folks can really get involved. There are all these groups like the Indivisible groups, healthcarevoter.org or .com, I can't remember which one, is a good resource as well. But there are plenty of folks who are already mobilized who might have similar issues that they care about deeply as you do, and sort of getting plugged in and making sure that your voice is heard is going to be incredibly important in 2018. And we'll have more on that when the toolkit drops in about 2 weeks. That's about it.
Great. Thank you, Drew. So I know there was a lot of information that we briefed on through. So we want to open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, I can take you off of mute if you just let me know. I lost her. But I do see another question. So in the past, I see Jean has a question. In the past, info on judges has been hard to find. Good resource. Yeah, I imagine so. And I think that's because of the local nature of judges and the races that they run. And so, I don't know, Drew, what do you think about like local races, like for finding information? I would just like think about like local political parties have their voter slates, their candidate endorsements. I don't know if the League of Women Voters have a, if they do local races like that, but I agree. Information on judges is usually a bit more difficult to find, but I would definitely look as local as you can.
Absolutely. Looking at sort of the county or city level Democratic or Republican parties for who they're endorsing is always a good way to find information. I would also suggest if you're in a big enough city, a lot of times the major papers won't cover this, but some of the smaller, more independent newspapers, sort of the free monthlies or weeklies, often have very detailed voter guides and voter resources that do in fact cover judges. So sometimes you need to dig outside of more typical journalistic resources, but in a lot of cases they are there.
Great, thank you, Drew. And Andrea, yes, this will be available. I don't know if it will be later today, but definitely in the next couple of days, we'll have it up on our website to share. And Wahida, to answer your question, we didn't per se look at a sample ballot. What we did is we went to Ballotpedia, which is it's kind of a sample ballot. It's kind of an online ballot, and they show you if you have ballot measures in your state or county. Basically, you put your address in. And I also tried to somewhat unsuccessfully show folks my paper ballot that I received here in my county, now Alameda County, but it was pretty hard to see. But I think Ballotpedia, if you're looking for an example of a sample ballot online, is good to check out, because then you can see candidates there and you can read a little bit about candidates and measures if they've qualified. Hey, any other questions? Great. Well, I certainly hope this was helpful. So remember that this was only the first in our webinar series. We'll be hosting these almost like once a month. until September, like leading all the way up to the November elections, midterm elections. This recording will be available. We can make slides available, and of course that ballot measure screening tool that I shared will also be available to anyone who would like it. But really specifically for chapters and members who are going to be doing GOTV work, please be sure to check it out and really use it. Hey, wasn't good. Did you have some closing words for us? No. Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Drew.
Not a problem. Thanks, everyone.